Well, good evening, everybody. It's evening here, but I appreciate that it's afternoon where you are. And thank you, Brian, and thank you, Terry. Hopefully, what you're seeing now is slide number 2. I've got numbers on the slides for 2 reasons. One, because here in the English countryside, the internet service isn't terribly reliable, so I might have to hand over to Terry to advance the slides. But also, I'll be skipping through some of these slides pretty quickly, and if you see anything that I pass that you're interested in, maybe just make a note of the slide number. We can come back to it. Those of you who are not fans of Monty Python, you can just ignore the headings in bold type, the irony of which will probably escape you. So I'm going to tell you now what I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to talk about it. First of all, although it may sound obvious, I'm going to talk why is linking reforestation to growth and yield important. And for those of you who are outside the province of Alberta, I should be clear that I'm primarily going to be talking about the special importance that it has within the context of Alberta. But I'll only spend a few minutes on that. And then I'll talk a bit about, what's missing with existing growth and yield models, why are we having to bother with this FRIPSY project. And then I'll get on to talk about why and how to use FRIPSY a bit, and a little bit, but not too much, on how it works. And then I want to also talk somewhat about some of the problems I ran into in terms of validation issues with this sort of a system, and the feedback that I've had from reviewers so far. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about what's next, but being as I am in the process of retiring, that won't be up to me, that will be up to FGrOW and its new director, who just happens to be called Brian. So why is linking reforestation to growth and yield important in Alberta anyway? And cost would seem might seem to be a good reason, given that we must be spending something in the order of $200 million dollars per year on it, I would guess. And then allowable cut effect was probably the main stimulus for starting this work. There was a great deal of optimism 20 years ago that we could gain allowable cut by appropriately quantifying the yields that were to be expected. That expectation, I think, has been somewhat reduced since 2006 and the mountain pine epidemic. But I think maybe more importantly, and especially in the current environment, the legal and policy requirements for managing timber on a sustained yield basis are somewhat special to Alberta and are a very important driver, though there are similarities with some of the other Canadian provinces, less so with the situation in the US and other countries. And that also creates a reforestation liability, whereby in order to cut timber on public lands in Alberta, industry assumes the liability for reforestation and wants to hand it back as soon as possible, which has led to the development of reforestation standards for judging whether or not that liability has been met. And both of those things, the legal and policy framework, the reforestation liability, and the fact that we've got the private sector operating on public lands, has led to what I think is maybe the most important reason for linking reforestation to growth and yield, and that is to limit the exposure of both the industry and the government to adverse scrutiny. And I will make some comments on that right at the end of the discussion. Slide number 4 now. Just a little bit of history. In the year 2000, the Foothills Growth and Yield Association was formed, and the regenerated lodgepole pine trial started. And both those initiatives were predicated by the fact that both industry and government felt that while we had a lot of information on the growth and yield of fire origin stands, we had very little in terms of the post-harvest condition, what happened to regeneration after harvest. Then, after some deliberation, the Alberta Reforestation Standards Science Council in 2001 reported to the minister and made the recommendation, a very strong recommendation, that reforestation standards in Alberta should be linked to growth and yield. So the gods had spoken, and that all seemed like a good idea, but of course it turned out not to be so easy. It took an intervention by the Alberta Forest Products Association, who ended up working with the government in developing a framework for linking reforestation standards to growth and yield. And that framework was agreed on in 2004. And that led to the development of alternative regeneration standards over the next few years. GYPSY, which is the growth and yield prediction system developed by and approved by the Alberta government, was approved for the purpose of linking regeneration standards to growth and yield in 2009. And the alternative regeneration standards then were morphed into what became the regeneration standard of Alberta in 2010. And then here we are 10 years later, and we're bringing out FRIPSY. So what's the purpose of FRIPSY? Well, when I first got interested in this, it was actually predicated by the need that I felt existed for people to understand and apply the results from the regenerated lodgepole pine project, where we were producing every year or two, we produce crop performance reports. We published a couple of papers on it, and we'll be publishing another one. And we were doing other technical reports and quick notes, but I felt very strongly that these were not meeting we're not helping people that much who we wanted to help in understanding and applying the results to their particular situations, because the real purpose is to assist silviculturalists and timber supply planners in selecting which prescriptions or reforestation strategies best meet the management objectives. And in Alberta, we do have this rather special situation where both the management objective, the timber management objective, which is the only actually legislated objective, and the standard, the reforestation standard, are defined in terms of mean annual increment of timber. And so the emphasis is on forest growth. And with MAI being the objective, then linking it to reforestation standard is what I would refer to here as the holy grail in the metaphor with Monty Python. Had the had the standard or the objectives been defined in terms of biodiversity indices or something like that, then that's what we'd have been working on. But the fact is that this is the legislated policy and regulated standard that we are working with in Alberta. I think in terms of the next thing that I want to talk about with, well, why can't we just use existing growth and yield models? Isn't that what models like GYPSY are for? I think it helps in discussing that to talk about or distinguish between two phases in the crop rotation: regeneration and growth. And this is a distinction that is made within the regeneration standard of Alberta. And these two phases tend to have rather different characteristics, and I won't get into too much detail here, but I mean, obviously in regeneration, we're typically talking about seedlings and saplings versus trees. What's very significant in the context of Alberta, and certainly very much so in the context of lodgepole pine in Alberta, where you get natural regeneration, whether you want it or not, typically on most sites, then during the regeneration phase, we see increasing density as a result of ingress, whereas during the growth phase, what we're primarily looking at is decreasing density related to mortality. And the mortality factors, if we can put aside for the moment the catastrophic mortality factors like fire and mountain pine beetle, during the growth phase, whereas we're pretty much dealing, and most of the modeling has been developed to deal with mortality associated, the dynamics of tree competition. During the regeneration phase, we're talking multiple mortality factors, not so much intraspecific tree competition, but competition between species, competition with non-tree vegetation, and climatic factors, and especially in the case of lodgepole pine, numerous pathogens and diseases. It's probably also worth mentioning that in the context of Alberta and much of Canada, much of the management emphasis, we do most of our active management early in the rotation to achieve reforestation, and are pretty passive during the subsequent growth phase. And whereas we've got pretty good information, and with a great deal of modeling attention being given to the growth phase, the knowledge base for regeneration typically, and I'm not saying this happens everywhere, but I think most people would agree, more so than in the growth phase or relative to the growth phase, the knowledge base is poor. The density, this graph shows the density trend that is typically predicted by existing growth and yield models, and it basically represents mortality, and therefore it never goes up. It only goes down. Also note that it's typically based on densities of trees above breast height, 1.3 meters, what we call the N13 standard in Alberta. And of course, that's also the tagging limit at which we start measuring basal area. So we've got this density line AB, which culminates at A and then goes down. But the actual trend doesn't happen quite like that. Instead of ACB that you see there, it's more like DCB, with culmination at C, with the ascending density resulting from ingress and ingrowth, and that line DC cuts in at when the trees hit breast height. And by definition, that point C, it occurs at where we bridge between the regeneration phase and the growth phase, which covers the rest of the time line, which is shown here as from 0 to R, which is rotation. So the predicted growth phase trend, if the performance survey that we do for plugging into the growth and yield models, if that performance survey is done after culmination, then it's going to predict that things are going to proceed along line EB, and that is correct. Or at least it's correct to the extent that the growth and yield models appropriately represent development during the growth phase, and an awful lot of work has been done on that to make sure they do. However, things aren't so good if the performance survey has to be undertaken before culmination. And in that case, if we do the performance survey at time P here, then as you can see, line EF is now incorrect. Without getting too much into the complexities of how attempts have been made in Alberta to deal with this, I'll just briefly mention, though, that under the regeneration standard of Alberta, the RSA, Xiongming, Huang, and the folks have come up with a sort of a fix where they do the early performance survey, but the early performance survey is done based on trees above stump height, not waiting for trees to get to breast height. And the assumption is that the density, density at stump height, which will intersect this the density curve at point G, and will somehow equate to the N13 density at as shown at point C. For a reason that I'll get to, or I will mention a little bit later on why this might not be entirely a bad guess, but suffice it to say that when we started making predictions based on this, we do see some instability compared to doing predictions based on what is happening at point C and what is happening to trees that have reached breast height. Which brings us to well, actually, what it brings us to is, before we get to what it brings us to, I will just try and summarize what I just said very quickly, that stand dynamics are well known and modeled for the growth phase, but not for the regeneration phase. And that's okay if the performance assessment can be delayed until after the regeneration phase and after density culmination. However, both Xiongming and I have separately, with separate data, looked at where that transition occurs in lodgepole pine, and which is also very similar for aspen, and it's mostly it seems to be about 18 years after cut, though obviously it varies between sites. But I should add the caveat to that even in pine and aspen, it doesn't happen that early if we do something, we do a management intervention that somehow lengthens or reinvigorates the regeneration phase. And I will come to that again because it turns out to be quite important. With spruce, as has rather elegantly been demonstrated by Robert Froese with the empirical post-harvest data, that regeneration phase, that whole transition can take a lot longer and halfway through the rotation, and yet we have this situation in Alberta where nobody is really keen on extending the performance assessment and the associated reforestation liability beyond 12 to 14 years. So to go back to this, or to go to my using the Black Knight from Monty Python as a metaphor, he's still standing in as much that the system is doing things pretty good during the growth phase, but when it comes to the entire rotation, including the regeneration phase, something is missing. And now I'll talk about why use FRIPSY. So given the situation I've just described, we're pretty much, I think there's only about four alternatives. We can revert to the early arbitrary stocking standard that was in place prior to about the year 2000. And those of you who were practicing silviculture in Alberta at that time will probably recognize why I haven't put a smiley face beside that. We can delay performance assessment and yield forecasting to after 18 years or much later in the case of spruce and mixed woods, and that is, for a reason I've explained, is not a very popular option. So why can't we just come up with extend existing growth models or build new growth models to include the regeneration phase? And the reason I put a question mark against that is that I really don't know how you do that, and that relates to the fact that, as I somewhat indicated earlier, the drivers for stand development during the regeneration phase tend to be a bit different from those during the growth phase. So that led to the fourth option, which is why not develop regeneration models for the regeneration phase and somehow link that to growth models which are already well developed in some cases for the growth phase. And that is basically what FRIPSY is all about. So FRIPSY involves the regeneration model on the left, into which requires us input some information on ecological strata. In Alberta, to a large extent, based on the ecosite classification developed by Ian Corns and co, and which I believe and hope most silviculturalists in Alberta are familiar with and using. And we also input information on treatments, and the regeneration model projects on that basis top height, age, density, stocking, and basal area by species groups, which is used as input to the GYPSY model, which hands over to GYPSY, and the GYPSY model then projects that for the rest of the rotation. I'll very quickly skim through just give you a quick idea on how to use, on what it involves to use FRIPSY. There's a simple three-step input process where you enter stand, site, and establishment factors. This can be done in batch mode. What I'm showing you here is with the interactive single stand processor. And you select projection options then. This adjustment for Western gold rushes, it simulates a special rule in the regeneration standard of Alberta that excludes girdled trees on the assumption that they're going to die. That has raised some interesting questions, and we've come up with some interesting answers on that, which I won't get into today, but I will talk about next month. You can exclude natural regeneration if you wish, if you just want to focus on plantation, and the dynamics of planted stock. And if you have the right little bit of software from the Alberta government, you will be given options for reporting GYPSY output, which are the projections made to rotation. And FRIPSY recognize what I refer to as events, and this is simply silvicultural events from cut through site preparation, planting, weeding, if you choose to, pre-commercial thinning, and then performance refers to the year at which you'd like the model to simulate a regeneration performance survey. And the built into the model is some nice user-friendly warnings, error and warning messages, which hopefully keep you on the straight and narrow. That's the interactive, that's the I for interactive part of the acronym FRIPSY. The output, one of the things from earlier versions that people were pretty insistent about was they like to get one summary page of output and then have the details separately. So in this output report or output summary report, you get a regeneration forecast that forecasts stand conditions at the stand ages specified for each event. So in this example, no thinning has been selected, and we talk about the performance and handover. And if you do thinning, then you get a prediction of what's there before and after thinning, depending on what target you set for thinning. And at the bottom of that summary report is a yield projection summary, which takes the most important variables out of the GYPSY simulation, site index, and then the other variables that are reported at rotation, which is defined as culmination age of lodgepole pine, merchantable mean annual increment. And if you want it, you can get a whole bunch of the normal stuff that GYPSY puts out, which includes a yield table and graphics. The devil, of course, is in the detail, and I won't get too much into the detail of how the model is structured, except to say that the model recognizes basically 5 treatments. Though for cut, we only use cut. We assume clear cutting. We don't make a distinction between types of clear cutting, like stump side or roadside. We just need to know the date when you did the cut. And then we have the 4 treatments that I referred to: site preparation, planting, chemical weeding, and thinning. And then I show 5 blocks below, which represent what I'm referring to as cohorts, basically species, except that in the case of pine, we have to split it between the planted cohort and the natural regeneration cohort, because they tend to have different dynamics. And then for all cohorts, what we're interested in predicting is top height, age, stocking percent, and density. This is within the regeneration model. And in the case of aspen and pine, we also include DBH and basal area. And we also define the site factors that I previously referred to, 5 of which are mandatory. They're needed, and then there's some optional ones if you have to have information on them. And of course, the whole emphasis of the modeling is to try and figure out which are the useful links that can be used for prediction between these various components. And to start with, before we even look at the treatment effects, we see links which and these what I show here in the lines of the links that we found useful in modeling. And by link, I mean in a statistical sense, dependencies or effects. So we're already getting into some fairly complicated relationships, but what we're really interested in is establishing the links between treatments and these stand variables. And this we could stop right here if this was all happening on a totally uniform site, but of course it isn't. So then we have to bring in the side effects. And it was at about this point of the analysis that it finally dawned on me why other researchers didn't seem too interested in getting into regeneration modeling. Having said that, the actual modeling, the types of models are pretty straightforward. The majority were just using a standard least squares analysis of covariance, multiple linear regression, the sort of statistics that most of you are somewhat familiar with. And then we use logistic regression to cover things like stocking, percent stocking probability, and I won't get into, but we also distinguish between single state and two state models. But we end up with a total of about 40 submodels to describe those linkages that were shown in the previous diagrams. And selected those the variables to go into those models based on, again, some pretty standard statistical criteria, effect test, goodness of fit, contribution to explain variation, but also had to consider some rather more subjective items, biological rationality, and the availability of input data. So we selected variables as much as we could that most users would have access to. So I guess now it's time for the Spanish Inquisition. Are these predictions any good? And the model was based primarily on the regenerated lodgepole pine trial, which I won't be describing today, but I will describe in much more detail at the next webinar. And I should just mention that the RLP trial was designed to look at planting, weeding, and pre-commercial thinning. But it also showed some interesting trends with site preparation, but site preparation was not controlled experimentally. But very fortunately, the Sundance site preparation trial had been and was already in existence and had been specifically designed to investigate just that. So in 2017, we did a remeasurement of that trial and used that information to contribute to the model. We also compared the model with operational data, specifically data from performance surveys made under the regeneration standard, the reforestation standard of Alberta that are stored on the empirical post-harvest database, and I did run into right away some problems, some of which were expected, some weren't. Lack of experimental control, which is a problem with any operational data used for this purpose, some site stratification problems, and some problems of incomplete tree counts, which I'll come back to in a minute. I won't talk too much about adjustments that I did make to the model. Suffice it to say that there were some proportionality reductions that were made where overestimation was considered possible based on comparisons with the RSA and the the trial data, and also based on some theoretical considerations. That will be documented in the report, and I won't get into it here. What I think, and it also made adjustments based on the Sundance site preparation model to the effect of mounding on pine ingress, which appeared to have been in the RLP model was likely confounded with side effects. But what I do want to mention is the adjustments that were not made to the model, and that was a lower herbicide response that was observed that I could see in the RSA data compared to the model, which appeared to result from differences between experimental and operational treatment. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then we also didn't make adjustments for lower densities observed in the RSA data, which appeared to result from intentional tree exclusions, intentional and maybe unintentional tree inclusions, stratification areas, and what you'd more normally expect, which are just the bigger gaps that you get in stands compared to experimental installations. And I'm not going to have time, I'm afraid, to get too much into this, so I'll just very briefly point out that, okay, the problem with site stratification is that it appeared that most of the, when we looked at openings in the database for pine, the vast majority of those were stratified as being medium site, mesic, soil nutrient class, and whereas that is possibly right, it appeared to be unlikely to apply across all these openings where we did observe productivity differences that would, and competition differences that would suggest that there were other sites involved. And that kind of impacts on the next two things. When we look at pine densities, what is observed in the RSA performance survey, which is A here, that's only 50% of what was predicted by, I'm sorry, that's only 50% of what the model predicted. And that might seem really worrying, but actually that is explainable in terms of the reduction for western gall rust, which accounts for about 30%, and is probably also related to other capping and tree exclusions and stratification. When we get to, there's some other things here that are kind of interesting, but I'm running out of time. But what I must mention is because it's worrying, is the aspen density effect, whereby the regenerated lodgepole pine trial showed very significant predicted effect of tending, as indicated by the orange bars, I'm sorry, and little or no observed effect when we look at the empirical post-harvest data. And there's a couple of possible explanations for that. One is that silviculturalists are very smart, and they tend to focus treatments on the problematic stands that really need treatment. That might somewhat explain what we see here, but it is really very striking when you look at this EPH data, how much aspen is left on the tended, that is the part of the landscape that has been treated with herbicide. And that does kind of leave you with the conclusion that there's something else going on here, and that operational treatments might not be as effective as experimental treatments. I don't have time to talk about the comparison with the Sundance site preparation trial, but suffice it to, again, that'll be documented, but suffice it to say that after adjustments, there's generally pretty good agreement. So I guess the bottom line, are predictions realistic? Well, this is difficult to judge using non-controlled operational data. And what is left most uncertain are the predicted responses to weeding that we see in the regenerated lodgepole pine trial and that are simulated by the model, but it looks like that those responses may not be consistently achievable in operations. Okay, now I'll come back to that point, but to finish with, but I'll just very briefly mention that some reviewer, well, I guess I appreciate, I'm grateful that so far anyway, the Spanish Inquisition has been very kind, and most of the reviewers' questions and comments were very gentle, and I don't have time to go through all of these right now, but we can come back to them if there is time later, so I'll skip them. But there is one of the questions which I think really is very central to where we've ended up here was, well, okay, does FRIPSY correctly predict suckering of aspen after weeding or thinning? And well, it does do that to the extent that it can from the regenerated lodgepole pine trial measurements. And I think to try and answer that question, I'm just showing some of the latest data here. The model was based on data up to the 18 years. This chart here shows data up to 2 years further on, up to 20 years. And you see here that in the control plots, we're seeing what we'd kind of like to see and expect to see, that things have peaked by 18 and are just starting to go down as intertree mortality kicks in. We're also, but notice also that we're seeing in the RLP trial very little suckering after chemical weeding with or without thinning. That is treatments W and WT in the diagram. So that effect was that's what the model's predicting as well, but that's the response that conflicts with the operational data. Also, what I thought was interesting was that the latest measurements, the 20-year measurements, indicate that FRIPSY may be underestimating the effect of suckering after non-chemical hardwood removal. That's treatment T, shown in orange. And you see, instead of peaking at 18, which is kind of assumed, it's going on up. Now, I say that may underestimate the effect of suckering because it's not really clear at the moment how important this continued suckering is, this continued ingrowth is, because up to 20 years anyway, although we're still seeing a substantial increase occurring in tree density, it's very unsubstantial in terms of basal area. So we're just going to have to keep monitoring to see what happens there. Okay, a few parting shots in terms of what next. Well, already committed, and what I'm committed to involvement in is technical documentation of this of the modeling work. That we're having a webinar on the RLP project, which was the basis for a lot of that, and also some of the other related projects. And I'm committed to reports. I should point out that I would be a bit further along on that if I hadn't spent so much time, or I'm not spending so much time at the moment on preparing PowerPoint presentations. And although it will be subject to approval by the executive of FGrOW and the Foothills Pine team, I'm assuming that we will act on the commitment to release FRIPSY by 2021. What's been circulated so far is a beta version. But I would like to make a few points about future work. this won't be up to me. This will be Brian's life from now on, and it'll be up to him and the membership, of course. But I would like to take a kick at the cat in terms of what I think is important. I think, first of all, extending regeneration modeling to other species and ecoregions. In that regard, I do believe that whatever Robert Froese comes up with in his design and review of regeneration modeling options for mixedwood will be really important, because the problems that I've described for pine in terms of linking practice and standards to growth and yield, they're going to be even more significant in spruce and mixedwoods than they are in pine, and also more challenging to deal with for a variety of reasons. But I think that is really important, and I hope that initiative grows and is successful. And I'll make one last, I guess one of my pet interests is I do believe that it is really important that FGrOW develops what I refer to here as a shared and controlled monitoring strategy for reforestation treatments. And the reforestation treatments I'm talking about here are nothing new or fancy. I'm talking about, and maybe not very sexy, I'm talking about those that we're already doing on a very widespread basis that are incurring high levels of cost already, and whose effects are uncertain or are of concern to stakeholders. And the reason that I think that is so important is that that even though this sort of work these sort of projects may not appeal too much to researchers, I do think they can help in cost-effective achievement of management objectives. But I think that if done properly, they definitely will defend you against adverse stakeholder scrutiny and the associated risk to timber supply, which are considerable. So I was going to say that's my last kick at the cat, but I guess I get another kick at the cat next month. So I'll probably bring up some of this again. Thank you very much to the companies who supported development. And I haven't mentioned names of the company people here, but I would like to thank those unnamed people who have shown great patience in reviewing previous versions of the workshops, etc., as well as contributing data, time, and money. I should thank Julia Gulias for his skilled assistance, Xiaomin Wang, who developed GYPSY and has given me much advice over the years, and Sharon Meredith, without whose oversight this project wouldn't have happened. And thank you all for listening to me.